welcome to week 2. This week we just have 3 videos to go through. And this week our objective is going to be analyzing our solver solutions, right? So in week 1, we went through this process of, okay, what is linear programming? How do we solve it graphically? And then more importantly, let's just let Excel solve it for us and let Excel do all the heavy lifting. Okay, fair enough. Well, now, once Excel has solved it, what do we do with it? What does all this stuff mean, right? And that's the purpose of this second week. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with this problem. This is the problem from week 1. This was that maximization problem that I solved for you graphically, and then I solved it in Excel. And now I'm going to solve it in Excel again. But now we're going to look at the sensitivity reports that Excel provides for us. All right? And before I do that, I just want to point out again, look at the way I've set this up. This will become very obvious in just a moment when I run Solver and show you these reports. I like doing it this way because actually Solver is intelligent enough to realize that x1 and x2 are my choice variables, and then it will actually call my constraints, constraint 1, 2, and 3. Right? So it's going to label everything. So how do we go about doing this? Okay. Again, we're going to use Solver. So go to Data, far right, Solver, and here we go. And you can see that I've already been goofing around, so I want to clear all this out for you. Right? Pretend like we're starting all over. Okay? All right, so what's our objective? Objective function. We're going to maximize this by changing these 2 cells. And we've got these 3 constraints. So again, I'm going to take the easy way. Just highlight that, less than or equal to that. Hit OK. I've got my non-negativity constraints, right? x1, x2, greater than or equal to 0. And I got my simplex LP method. So now I hit solve. Now this is what we were doing last week. And here, this tells me to get to produce 6 units of x1 and 8 units of x2. And I'm going to get $110 in profit. Okay, great. Now, what Excel does when it solves for that, you get this little box. And last week we just hit OK. This week it's different. Now I want you to highlight these 3 reports. So Excel gives us these 3 reports. Now hit OK. And you'll look down at the bottom of my screen. Here they are. Excel will produce my answer report, my sensitivity report, and my limits report. Okay? So I want to go through all 3 of these with you. So I'm going to start with, here we go. I'm going to start with the answer report. Okay, so this one actually it's pretty basic. It's just telling you stuff. The solver engine, we use simplex LP. It took 0.015 seconds. It had 2 iterations. A lot of precision here. Okay, blah blah blah. That's who cares. This is what I want you to get at. Okay, so here is my objective function. Now, its original value was 15. So again, remember when I go back here and I put in a 1 and a 1, right, the original value was 15. That's all this is saying. And then it's saying, oh, look, your final value, by the way, was 110. Well, that was my profit. Same thing here. It's saying, okay, look, your choice variable x1, see, that's why I like labeling it this way, right? My choice variable x1 start off with 1. My choice variable x2 start off with 1. But notice its final values were 6 and 8. So I'll go back here and change these to 6 and 8. Right? Okay, and they're continuous variables. And then I get into my constraints. And again, I like this because it's named my constraints, constraint 1, 2, and 3. And so it's telling me my cell value, 6, 8, and 14. That's this. What were the constraints? I used 6 units of constraint 1, 8 units of 2, 14 units of 3. All right? And then this is what I like. Binding or not binding. Okay? If a constraint is not binding, that means that you have an inequality. The equal sign does not have any relationship here. So what I mean by that is if I go back here, right, 6 is strictly less than 12, right? So what we say is that we have slack in that constraint. And in this particular case, we have 6 units of slack, right? Because this could have gone all the way up to 12, right? 12 less than or equal to 12. But I only used 6, right? So I have a slack of 6 units in my first constraint, right? I could have used up 6 more units of constraint 1. Now notice here in constraints 2 and 3, 8 equals 8. 14 equals 14. So we would call these constraints binding, right? As a result, they don't have any slack, okay? So your binding constraints don't have any slack, whereas your non-binding constraints are going to have what we call slack, all right? So all this information is right here in answer report. Now I'm going to skip the sensitivity report and go to your limits report real quick. And I have to be honest with you, the limits report is not, sometimes it's really not that useful, but nonetheless, to be thorough, I think it's important that we go through this. So, what is this telling us? This is telling us that, you know, our objective function was maximized at $110. All right, and then down here, choice variable x1, we produced 6. Here we produced 8 units of good 2. Well, what this is telling me, and this is one of the reasons why I do like it, what this is telling me is that these are actually the upper limits to both of these variables. So I could produce, given my constraints, I could produce no more, all right? And here, well actually, yeah, because of my 2 binding constraints. And here, what that's telling me is that my objective, I'm going to get 110. What this is telling you is that if you don't produce any x1, but you produced 8 units of x2, then your profit would have been 80. And of course that would have just been 8 times 10, right? And then what this is telling you is that if I didn't produce any units of good 2, but produced the 6 units of good 1, right, then my profit would have been 30. And of course that would have just been the 6 times 5, right? 6 times 5. So that is our limits report. Now here, this middle one, the sensitivity report, this is the big one. So, So I want to go through this very carefully. Okay, so you start off here. Here are your variable cells. So these are x1 and x2, right? And it starts off, the final value for each, 6 and 8. And then we get to what Excel calls a reduced cost. The reduced cost is saying, look, so this is, they call it a cost. Sometimes it's called the cost, a dual value, shadow price. What this is telling us is the impact of the non-negativity constraints on x1 and x2. So remember, x1 and x2 are greater than or equal to 0. What this is telling you is that even if I increased x1, that constraint, by 1 unit, it's not going to have any effect on this problem. So in other words, if I said x1 had to be greater than or equal to 1, nothing would change in this problem. And so I can show you that. So I'm going to go back here. I'm going to resolve this, right? But now what I'm going to do is, instead of clicking this box, I'm actually going to say, look, this cell right here, this cell is x1. This has to be greater than or equal to 1. And then I'm going to say, this cell, this is x2, has to be greater than or equal, and I'm just going to keep this at 0, right? And now I'm going to run my solver, and guess what? Nothing's going to change. Look, nothing changed, right? Why? And you can obviously, you can see it because 6 and 8 are greater than 0, right? So even if I increase those non-negativity constraints, nothing is going to happen, right? Now the idea here is I just increase it by 1. Yes, if I said something like, you know, x1 has to be greater than or equal to 7, Well, okay, that's going to change things. Or that's going to have a reduced cost there, right? But the idea here is if I just change that constraint by 1 unit, increase it by 1 unit, then what this is telling me, the reduced cost is telling me that nothing's going to happen to my objective. I'm still going to produce 6 units of X1, 8 units of X2, and I'm still going to get a profit of 110. Okay. Now, what this is telling me is this is the coefficient on X1. So this was the profit per unit of X1, $5. And of course, the profit per unit on X2 was 10. And I can just go back, and that's these two numbers, right? Okay. Well, what this is telling me is the allowable increase and allowable decrease in this objective. So what this is telling me is that I can increase this coefficient by $5 or decrease it up to $5, and by gosh, I will still produce 6 units of X1. Now, that's holding everything else constant, right? And I should mention that if you read the book, which I highly recommend they do, if you read chapter 3, one of the criticisms of this sensitivity report is you have to, when you're looking at stuff like for choice variable 1, you have to assume that everything else is held constant. So choice variable 2 will still have $10 per unit of profit. All of your constraints are going to stay the same, right? This is the only thing that can change, right? So I can show you that. So watch. I'll increase this to like $7, right? So let's say 7. Okay. So I'm going to run my solver. Same thing. Yeah, that should be okay. Okay. No, look. Notice that yes, my objective function changed, but this is telling me that I will still produce these amounts, and that's exactly what happened. Even though the profit per unit on good 1 went from $5 to $7, notice that the objective is still maximized by producing 6 units of X1 and 8 units of X2. It is true, of course, that the objective function itself is going to change, but that's because this changed, right? My profit has to go up, right? I'm getting more dollars per profit for X1. So yes, this is going to change, but my production plan did not change. That is what these are telling you, okay? Now notice here, for choice variable 2, what this is telling me is that actually I can increase the profit on choice variable 2 to infinity, right? Just so you guys know, 1e plus 30, this is scientific notation in Excel, and you would read this as 1 times 10 to the 30th power, right? So 1 with 30 zeros after it. So a huge number. Let's just think of this as infinity. So what this is telling us is that if I held the profit per unit on variable 1 constant, at $5, and then increased the profit per unit on the choice variable 2 to like 1,000, I'm still going to produce 6 and 8 units. So to show you that, I'll go back. Here's 5. No, seriously, and I'll make this like 10,000, right? And I'm going to solve it. And I'm still going to produce, I'm still going to produce 6 units of good 1 and 8 units of good 2. Yes, my profit has gone up substantially, but that's because the profit per unit on good 2 went up substantially. So that's what this area of the sensitivity report is telling you about. All right. Now we get into the area, I got to highlight this. Now we get into your constraint area. Okay. And so here, this just tells you the final value. So this is telling me that I use 6 units of constraint 1, 8 units of constraint 2, 14 units of constraint 3. Here are the right-hand side constraints. So in other words, this column is right here. And then the right-hand side That's this column, the 12, the 8, and the 14. The 12, the 8, and the 14. All right? Now, what's this shadow price? Well, first of all, let me explain something. Well, let me explain the shadow price first. The shadow price tells me that if I were to increase this constraint by 1 unit, nothing would happen to my profit itself, right? Because the shadow price is 0. However, if I increased constraint 2 by 1 unit, then my profit would go up by $5. Now, and that's holding everything else constant, right? So here, if I increased my constraint 3 by 1 unit, holding everything else constant, then profit would go up by $5. And of course, I can show you that. So I got to make this back to 10, right? I have to hold everything constant. And so let's just increase this by 1 unit. So let's go to 15. So we'll solve this. Voila. Right, my profit goes up to 115. Now in this case, right, I produced an additional unit of good 1. That's what got me the $5. So that's what this is telling you. So that's the shadow price. It tells you the impact on the objective function by increasing your constraint by 1 unit. All right? And then finally, we have these allowable increases and allowable decreases. So what this is telling us is that, like for this first constraint, I can increase the first constraint by an infinite amount, right? 10 to the power of 30 is a big number. So I can increase the first constraint by an infinite amount, and that shadow price of 0 will still apply, right? Or I could decrease constraint 1 by $6, and I'll still get a shadow price of 0. So I can show this to you. Now, why is this happening? Because look, the constraint here is less than or equal to 12. Well, I only use 7. So watch. I'm going to put in like 1,000,000. 3, 1, 2, 3, right? Here. So I have 1,000,000 units of constraint 1. Watch. I'll solve this. Nothing's going to happen. Nothing happened, right? Why? Because it's non-binding, right? So now let me go back. Let's see, that was, what was, oh, here, 12. Let me just go back to 12. There we go. Okay, so that is what these are telling us. Now, I can decrease this constraint by 6, and my shadow price will remain at 6. Well, you know, you can do that. So let me go down to 10, right, and watch. I mean, I can go down as far as 6, but I'll just knock off 2, solve, nothing happens, right? So that's what these are telling us. So let me go back to 12. And then, of course, so here, what this is telling me is that I can increase constraint 2 by 6 units, and the shadow price of 5 is still valid. Or I could decrease constraint 2 by 6, and this shadow price is still valid. And then the same thing applies to the third constraint. All right? So here is, and I wanted to go through this because obviously I think this is probably the most important thing, right? Because when you look at some of these, when you get into the business world, you know, this is telling you, if you set up a linear programming problem, you know, I like this because this is telling you how you can change, like in this case, the profit per unit, right? And your production plan is not going to change. So you could increase, you could just charge more, right? You could charge up to $5 more for good 1, you're still going to produce 6. You know, you could, you know, I don't want you to increase your profit by infinity, but let's face it, you could increase the price and therefore the profit of good 2, and you'd still produce 8. Now, I know that this has to be in conjunction with the market, right? It's not like you can just increase your price an infinite amount and still expect to sell 6 or 8 units, right? I understand that. But what this is telling you is this is telling us the flexibility that the firm has, right? And then the same thing here. This is describing the flexibility the firm has in regards to its constraints, right? So obviously in this case, what I would want to do if I were the firm manager is I would want to get my hands on more units of constraint 2 and constraint 3, right? Because A, they're binding, that's why they have the shadow price. And that's, I forgot to mention that. Non-binding constraints, right? Constraint 1 was not binding. Non-binding constraints always have a shadow price of 0. Binding constraints will always have shadow prices other than 0, okay? And so, for example, what this is telling us is that if I were the manager here, I would want to invest more or pay more to get more units of constraints 2 and 3. But the nice thing about this shadow price is, in a sense, you could think of this as like the maximum you should pay, right? Because this shadow price is telling me that if I increase constraint 2 by 1 unit, my profit will go up by 5, right? But the problem is I have to pay for that additional unit of constraint 2. Well, the maximum you'd be willing to pay is $5, right? Because I spend $5 to get the additional unit, right? And then I produce like an extra unit of, what do we do? This extra unit of good 1. So my profit went up to 115, but if I spent $5 to get that extra unit, then essentially my profit is still at 110, right? So the idea here is these shadow prices are the maximum amount a firm would want to spend on a constraint, right? So and then this is telling me, right, that for a shadow price of 5, I would only want to buy 6 more units of constraint 2. And for a shadow price of 5, I would only want to buy 6 more units of constraint 3. Now you have to understand, once you go above this allowable increase, then you need to rerun Solver and see what your shadow prices become. For all I know, those shadow prices could actually go down. Now they may go up, I don't know. But in that case, once I get outside of these allowable increases and decreases, you need to rerun your solver. And the same thing is true here, right? It would be inappropriate to say, what would my production plan be if I increased the profit per unit on good 1 by $7? This does not answer that question, right? You would have to increase the profit per unit, right? So that would, you'd have to put in a 12, and then you'd have to rerun the whole thing. In fact, I might as well do it. Let's just see what happens. I'll just do the sensitivity. Yeah, see how it changed? You know, here it everything changed. Well, let me make this bigger so you can see it. I guess I shouldn't say everything changed, right? But, you know, all this stuff, you know, a lot of these now, right? Now the allowable increase in variable 1 is infinite, right? Only decrease it by 2. So you can compare these two sensitivity reports, and they are completely different, right? And so that's I want to caution you on that. Once you go outside of these allowable increases and decreases in the sensitivity report, you really should run a new solver, right? And analyze what's happening now. Because look at some of these shadow prices, right? Now I have a shadow price for constraint 1. My shadow price for constraint 2 shot up to 10, and now all of a sudden constraint 2 doesn't have a shadow price, right? So that's my recommendation there. Okay, well that's it for the first video. So what I've done is I've walked through all 3 reports for a maximization problem. Then I'm going to, video 2, pardon me, I'm going to do the same thing, but for a minimization problem. And then in the third video, I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to use a different example, one that comes from your book, because I want to show you some interesting things that can happen. All right? So that's it for video 1. Look for me in this video 2 for week 2.